Welcome to the Content Mavericks Club, the podcast for independent-minded content makers and content marketers. I'm Jason Caffrey, CEO of podcast production and marketing agency Creative Kin, and I'm excited to have as my guest someone who I think is fair to say has a fascination for UK podcast listener trends. Adam Bowie is a commercial strategy manager at the BBC and a blogger who regularly picks apart UK podcast audience data. So, who's listening? How do they listen? When? And what are they doing when they listen? And that's what we're going to dig into. If you enjoy the Content Mavericks Club, you can show your support by leaving a 5-star review wherever you listen. Right now, though, let's meet Adam and get into it. Adam, thanks very much for taking time out for the Content Mavericks Club. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
If I could start, Adam, by just asking you blog a lot about UK listener podcast data, and I just want to give that context about the data itself. And briefly, if you can, just summarize, where does that data come from?
So I'd say there's three probably main sources at the minute of data. You've got Radar, who are actually the radio measurement body in the UK. So they measure BBC radio, commercial radio, everybody. They also now collect podcast data, and they have two sets of data. They have their main Radar data, which is the sort of quarterly survey that tells you how radio's listening, and there is some podcast data on that. And then they also have another survey called Midas data that they publish, I think roughly about 3 times a year, and that has a little bit more sort of non-linear audio listening. So it's not purely podcast data, it includes sort of streaming music listening, audio books or anything like that, so any kind of audio really. The second place you can get data is Ofcom. Ofcom have been publishing anyway, an annual piece of research called the Ofcom Podcast Survey. They published it in probably not the most helpful way for most people, because it's a big Excel table on their website. You have to go digging for it, and then when you get it, it's just sort of a massive table. I have on my blog summarized it for the last few years. So if you search for the Ofcom Podcast Survey and my name, Adam Bowie, you should find it. But there's a lot in there. It is completely all free and open, and obviously I'm only really skimming the surface of it, so there's a lot more data there. I think now the third place that you can get data there is Edison. So for those who don't know, Edison Research are an American research company. They're known, I guess, in our circles for things like their Share of Ear report, which is a big survey that in the US and a few other territories, where they actually sort of break down how much listening is going on to radio, how much is going on to podcasts, audio books, streaming services like Spotify, etc. And because they've been doing it for many years, you can see some really long-term sort of trends and see what's happening.
So what's the big picture in the UK right now? What does the podcast audience look like?
So the podcast audience is growing. It's now different companies do measure it in different ways. So it's around, roughly speaking, a quarter of people or so are listening to a podcast every week, or adults, which is a nice number. Obviously, if you look over a longer period of time, that number creeps up. And similarly, the ad revenue growth for podcasting is also going up on a year-on-year basis. So this is a growth market overall. Another interesting metric that Ofcom looks at is the number of different podcasts people listen to. And on average, and this is going to sound low, and it is low, it's about 5.5. I think it's 5.4 podcasts a week that people are listening to amongst those who listen regularly to podcasts. It's not sort of knocking TV off the schedule. We have the way I always like to look at it, we have now a lot of things competing for our media time, if you like,
right.
TV, radio, streaming services, gaming, reading books, whatever it is. And the attention that people have got available means that if you do one extra thing, that probably means you're doing one fewer of something else.
The analysis that you have done on your website, and I would encourage anybody to just go over to your blog if they want to see this firsthand, because I know that in the podcast community, Adam, everyone's like, thank goodness for Adam. He kind of takes all of the raw data and turns it into something that we can usefully digest. But it does give us an indication of who is listening, right? In quite broad demographic terms, what is the data telling us about who the audience is for podcasts?
So the good news is it's generally a pretty attractive audience from most people's metrics. So it's a bit younger than average. It's also quite diverse. It's male and female audiences are quite similar. It's where some media might be a little bit more aligned to one or the other. It's also really great for reaching minority groups, and I tend to think about that because they're probably better catered for, because if your interest is something that mainstream media is not so good at offering, you can find it, and you can find a group that you're with. So if you look at ethnicities, overall ethnic minorities, where we're talking about 24-25%, it might be into the high 30s, 38%, according to the Ofcom numbers. Obviously, the type or the genre of podcast will vary. You can look at something like sport, that's probably going to skew male. You look at true crime, yes, it does skew female. And there are going to be variances there. But it is a great way of reaching, they are younger audiences. If you are targeting older audiences, there'll probably other media choices you would make to reach those audiences than podcasts.
And when you talk about younger audiences, I mean, I've seen some measures that break the cohorts down. What age range would you say are the most enthusiastic?
25 to 44. 45 to 54 is not that bad behind either. So probably if you sort of looked largely at those groups. Children, not too sure, because actually a lot of the research excludes children just because there are some rules around measuring doing audience surveys amongst children. It can be a little bit tougher and trickier. But, the smallest group is definitely probably in the 55 and 65 pluses. That's not to say they don't listen to podcasts. They do. I think it's one of those things. If you seek it out, you will look for it. But it's probably not matching quite the demographics overall, and certainly is different to other forms of audio. Well, particularly something like radio, which would skew older. You're definitely skewing younger there.
I've been wondering, Adam, I don't know if you've got a view of this, about how far podcasts are getting out of the pod, if you like. I mean, they're called podcasts because the iPod did what it did for mobile listening of all kinds. But we're seeing, for instance, Amazon growing as a they're competing with Apple and Spotify, I think, increasingly in terms of being a platform. And they sell their smart speakers and things like that. How far do you think that those listening habits are coming out of earbuds and headphones and that very sort of ultra personal listening into maybe streaming it via a speaker at home or something like that?
So streaming via smart speakers is absolutely a thing. However, actually, podcasting, we'll talk about YouTube maybe separately, but podcasting overall is still very much a one-to-one thing. I think part of that's the nature of podcasts, in that, my specific interests, the great thing, the strength of it, if you like, and also sometimes the challenge is that if I've got a niche interest, I'm interested in, me personally, I'm interested in cycling. So if I want to listen to podcasts about cycling, disclaimer, I work on a cycling podcast. That's not a mainstream.
Give it a plug. Tell all the cyclists where they can go and get their dose.
Yeah, I work on a cycling podcast called The Cycling Podcast, which is about professional road cycling. But if you want to listen to follow that as a sport, it's not a mainstream TV thing. It's on Eurosport. There are magazines, there are websites, but it's not going to get covered on the 5 Live, sports news or on TalkSport particularly. You have to seek that out. As I as a listener will go and seek that out. However, maybe my partner has no interest in podcasts, in cycling. So me sticking it on in the kitchen or maybe on a long car journey might not be super popular, listening to an hour-long conversation about sports people they don't know. That's not to say there definitely aren't podcasts that appeal to quite wide groups, and obviously the most popular ones, you look at enormously popular genres like comedy, for the most part, unless you absolutely hate the comedian presenting, you're probably going to be quite happy sort of just playing that in the car.
You mentioned YouTube, Adam. I know that, for instance, Spotify is very strong in that space. Apple Podcasts as well. They're perhaps the 2 biggest platforms for podcasters. But I've long been hearing YouTube, and some quite different viewpoints on that. Some saying, you know what, you need to tailor your content to YouTube. Others saying, don't worry about it. Just stick a static image in and upload it to YouTube because there is a listenership there. What can you tell us about that?
So YouTube's a complicated kettle of fish, really. I think so. Each of the platforms, anyway, has some slight biases. I always think of Apple being slightly more loyal listeners. They're more wedded to the format. They're probably wealthier, just in a global sense, wealthier because Apple products are more expensive. Spotify skews a little younger, but they might not be quite as loyalist to podcasts as the Apple users. That's in part because if you think about Spotify as a platform, it offers, primarily, I think most people probably got Spotify for the music. And these days you've got audiobooks in there as well. So, Spotify's trying to cater to your every audio need. Apple Music, Apple Podcasts are 2 separate products in the Apple ecosystem. When you come to YouTube, I think you've got all of that and a little bit more. So YouTube can be brilliant for some podcasts and can be really bad for other ones. And I think it really depends on who your audience is and what kind of podcast you're doing. So you've certainly had a lot of what you would think of as just YouTubers who've sort of shifted across and created a podcast. And they have made basically something that's primarily in vision. Yep, they probably got some in vision microphones and they're wearing headphones, but they're sitting on maybe a set that's not dissimilar to the kind of set or kind of backdrop that they might use ordinarily for one of their other product things. But what the difference, and I'm being enormously generalistic here, is their regular YouTube drops are probably at a very YouTube optimized, 8 to 12 to 15 minutes, whatever YouTube algorithm is favoring at the moment. So there's probably space for at least 1, maybe 2 mid-rolls, and tightly edited, fast. You want to, if you look at the sort of the absolute ultimate, look at a Mr. Beast video, which is probably a little bit longer than that, but the editing is superb. It's the millions spent on it. Whereas their podcast is probably more of a conversation, sit down, we've got some laptops in front of us with some bullet points, but it's probably, a handful of people sitting in a room talking about whatever the subject matter at large is. And those kind of things do lend themselves enormously well. The people who make them know how to interact with cameras and look at the cameras and things like that. And they've probably got good setups and good lights. And really, it's a video. It's only a podcast because they've probably got a Shure. Everyone loves the Shure microphones on YouTube. They've probably got that Shure SM7B or whatever in there, right in front of their face. That's the only difference between their regular Rode clip mic or whatever they use for the rest of their podcasts. One of the biggest podcasts in the world, probably top 3 or whatever, is The Daily from the New York Times. And they do not visualize it. And it is on YouTube. You can go and find it on YouTube. And the number of views are really low. There is a static image. I mean, it's there. And if I want to find it, I'll find it. My suspicion is that the YouTube algorithm probably doesn't push static images as much as it does where there's things going on in the image. And obviously there's kind of in-betweeny bits. People use things like audiograms, which is where you get those kind of waveforms moving along in the image just to show there's something going on. You can definitely find audiences and reach audiences, and they're good for discovery. So I'm not saying don't do it, but it's not optimized for the YouTube environment. And for the most part, you're probably not going to gain big audiences that way.
Google's podcast they're closing, right? And that is going to move to YouTube. Do you think it will kind of close the space for the video also podcast?
Not really. I mean, truthfully, I always think of the way Google thinks of podcasts or YouTube in particular is a podcast would just be 5% bit better if you had pictures with it. So what's happening? Google Podcasts, which has been there, perfectly decent but never enormously pushed product, which always felt like a shame, particularly for the growth of podcasts, because so many of the people in the world have Android phones, and when you get a brand new Android phone, you can do things like Gmail and Google Maps and YouTube apps are all pre-installed and everyone uses them. They never pushed out Google Podcasts in quite the same way.
I always kind of assumed that Spotify had scooped up that Android podcast audience, actually, and that was one of the reasons perhaps why Google didn't quite get the market share.
It does to a bit, but Spotify, I think a lot of people, particularly if they're a little tangential, still feels like a premium product. Yes, you and I know that there's Spotify free and you can get music with ads and then obviously listen to podcasts. But it's interesting, sorry, going off on a bit of a diversion here, but it's really interesting to see that notably recently Spotify have taken a couple of their exclusives and made them now non-exclusive to Spotify. And when I say a couple, I mean the biggest. So Joe Rogan is now no longer exclusively on Spotify. You can listen to him it's on regular RSS, which means you can listen on any podcast app. Similarly, Crime Junkie, which is a massive true crime, one of the biggest podcasts in the world, again, has gone open RSS. And obviously that Spotify, their old thing was to get you into their system and then upsell you at some point to the premium. I think some audiences never came over just because maybe they just didn't like Spotify as a podcast platform. To be honest, if you're heavily into podcasts, there are better podcast apps out there that have slightly better functionality. But also some people, I think, just felt that, and look, I'm not inside Spotify's market research, but my suspicion is that some people feel that it's a premium offering and therefore they never went there, even though it might be in their market. And I do look at these things globally as well, and Spotify, that might not be the case in Europe and America, but that's definitely the case elsewhere, where Spotify might have that sheen of that's going to cost me, I can't afford it, I prefer free. But no, getting back to what Google's doing, so the podcast element's moving into YouTube Music, which, if you like, is their Spotify competitor. But then there's this weird slight overlap with regular YouTube. So it's not like you can't get things in regular YouTube. And I guess YouTube Music's kind of interesting sort of USP, if you like, is that you can flip between the video. So for me, just for a regular music track, you pick a track, and if there exists a video in the tab, you can flip between it very easily and quite seamlessly, with no real jump in the audio between the music and the video version of the song. And that's what they're looking at doing with podcasts. But they are also doing their stuff very differently. And there's I think the really interesting part of this, which hasn't really been talked about enormously, is that for the most part, when you publish a podcast and you monetize it the way you choose to monetize it, so maybe you use a company like Megaphone or Spotify, or maybe you choose Acast or Audioboom, or whoever your monetization partner is, you create the podcast with that partner, which includes the ads, and then you deliver it. And then the platform, whether I'm listening on Apple Podcasts or I'm listening on Spotify, we all hear the same thing, or we hear it to the point that it's dynamically generated the same thing. YouTube does not allow the insertion of audio ads. So if your partnership is with one of those sort of ad sales companies, they don't want you to do that. They want you to do more akin to what happens in the video space, where you're allowed a little bit of flexibility to do your own host-read ads. So you see this video is sponsored by the host of the video doing bits, but the pre-rolls and the mid-rolls are all sold by YouTube, and there's a rev share. And that's what they're doing in podcasts, which is a different model to anyone else. Because if I upload my podcast and it's available on Spotify gets zero. They are a distribution platform. I'm not sharing revenue with them. When I do serve my podcast via Apple, Apple is just a way to reach the audience. Apple is not asking for money. With YouTube, no ads. You can do your sponsorship as long as it falls within our guidelines, but we are sharing the revenue with you. And that's a different model. I mean, that's not to say I'm not sharing the revenue with my ad partner anyway, but, I'm having the terms dictated to there.
Yeah, interesting. It'll be interesting to see how it develops because as an aside, I've also seen some YouTubers that I've spent quite a lot of time with pulling away from the platform, not I think because they've not been successful, but because they essentially have got into chasing the algorithm and chasing the revenue that comes from that and just got burnt out. It will be very interesting to see, where podcasts go on YouTube. We're going to take a short break in just a moment, Adam, but I want to, before we do, just talk about what people are doing when they listen to podcasts, because for quite a long time, I think there was just an assumption that actually the commute, whether you were driving or taking public transport, that was one of the biggest times that people listen. And I'm sure there is a big audience there. But what is the data that you've been looking at saying about what people are doing when they tune into their podcasts?
Travel is still a big one. Obviously, in a kind of post-pandemic world, depending on your own circumstances, you may well be doing less commuting than you were previously. But, listening in car, listening just while people are walking are still, two of the biggest things. But at home is enormous. So just in general, at home, probably doing menial-ish things is the biggest single time that certainly in the Ofcom report, people said. Also doing, specifically talking about chores, you're doing the washing up, you're doing the ironing, you're doing the laundry, whatever it is. And then you kind of get into sort of activity-based sort of times of the day, so if you're, running or cycling or, walking, those kind of things, getting out and about. But also an important time of the day is just before going to bed as well. There's actually quite a big listening bump of people sort of maybe winding down with a podcast after the sort of later evening. Maybe they've been watching something on TV or whatever, but that's an important time as well.
The accompaniment to a fairly mundane task or something like exercising or something like that, and indeed that just before bedtime, that it sounds like it could have come out of a radar report from 20 years ago. It's really interesting that although the way that people choose podcasts and what they go for is very different to linear radio, it just strikes me that it's taking a similar role in some cases. You think that's fair?
Yeah, I think, no, definitely. The way I tend to think of these things is what your podcast is offering and when you think people are going to consume it. So, there are times of the day where for a lot of people, podcasts are not available, depending on what you do for a living and exactly when your job is, but, are you able to listen to a podcast while you're doing your work? There was a great piece of research actually in the New York Times a few years ago, but because they were thinking of sort of at the time day parts of when people would listen to podcasts, so the Daily, for example, which I've already mentioned, is released sort of 5-6 a.m. Eastern time, so that it is available for you to listen to on your commute, because people tend to want to wake up and find out what's going. My background is radio. That is the biggest time of the day. Radio beats other forms of media hands down at that time of the day, because people, it's not for nothing that things like the Today Show are enormous. or just breakfast radio in general. A daily news podcast, that's perfect time. Then you've kind of got the middle of the morning, and so maybe you haven't got time, but you might have breaks. Maybe you have a short, coffee break or whatever. And I think there's an untapped market, by the way, for super short podcasts that can fit some of these slots. So you can kind of segment the day up and work out when you think your audience might be listening to. That's kind of the way to think about it, I think. And I think it's really useful, especially when you're planning thinking about who your audience is and when they might be available to listen.
Still to come on this episode of the Content Mavericks Club, how podcast audiences have changed in recent years and the listener trends to look out for in future. We'll be back after a short break. You're listening to the Content Mavericks Club, the podcast for content professionals who like to do things their own way. I'm your host, Jason Caffrey, and my guest for this edition is BBC Commercial Strategy Manager and blogger Adam Bowie. Adam, I'd like to ask you how you think listening has changed, because I would say that my first significant engagement with podcasting was perhaps as far back as 2004, 2005. I was working in news at that time, so I think that is probably a cohort, a profession that was ahead of the curve. But it was quite a high bar to get involved. You had to probably use some sort of RSS aggregator. I remember things like Juice, that you would download it and it was all side loaded and things like that. It was a headache. It was quite technical. But what would you say over the last 5, thinking back to maybe just the year before the pandemic hit, where podcasting was, what the audience looked like, and how it's developed over that period?
It was interesting. There was this brief period during lockdown when you had that kind of explosion. And, I remember Twitter were definitely talking about getting into the podcast space. Facebook was suddenly interested in it as well. So there were a few sort of flurries like that. And I think people wondered if it was going to change everything. I think we've kind of reverted to norm. I talked before about podcasts kind of just sort of percent on percent, maybe 1 or 2% a year increasing. We saw maybe a brief surge during lockdown as people tried a lot of things maybe for the first time. And then it's kind of normalized as our lives have, largely speaking, normalized. I guess from a technical perspective, probably the thing to note is it's funny you were talking about how you used to have to sideload things. And somewhere in a drawer, I've still got a Creative Zen, which predated my iPod. And you did all kinds of hackery to, you would definitely be syncing with iTunes and things like that when you got an iPod.
Hang on to that and then give it another 20 and you can offer it to the Science Museum.
Yeah. I think it still works. I did try powering it not that long ago. There's a thing that happened recently, which anyone who has a podcast may be aware of, that Apple changed some settings in the latest version of iOS, which meant that a few people saw some falls in their podcast listening because, without getting into that because it was a side thing, but basically, if you listen intermittently to podcasts, it was a question of how many episodes did Apple Podcasts in the background download for you. I mention that because a lot of apps still are basically built around the download quietly in the background when a podcast drops, so that at the point you're ready to listen to it, it's there on your device, ready to go. And it doesn't matter if you're, in a plane, on the underground, or somewhere where there's no internet connectivity, you've got something to listen to. The change is probably that people are much more prepared to stream. In podcasts, you'll still hear largely talk about downloads or maybe listens, but actually streaming. So because our data packages have improved, that we don't need to think about that kind of thing so much. We have more gigabytes or unlimited data plans. I say I'm talking very generally there. This is still an issue in certain parts of the world where data is still enormously expensive. But in general terms, and connectivity tends to be better. So the idea that you would have to, download it on Wi-Fi at home, which again, even once we'd moved to phones, that would still be maybe the way you do it, rather than eat up your expensive data plan.
Yeah.
Or run the risk of running short of data before the end of the month or whatever. Now it's more a question of, I'm out, I'm about, someone tells me about a podcast, I just hit play and it goes. And it's still technically downloading in the background rather than streaming, but it's, and I think Spotify very much normalized that. You do still want the ability to listen offline, because anyone who's driven somewhere remotely where self-service drops out, or if you're on a plane and don't want to pay the earth for a very patchy internet connection on a plane, you do want to preload all those things onto your device before you go. So it's not like that's not a thing still. But then behind the scenes, there's a whole bunch of technical stuff. So I mentioned briefly before dynamic ad insertion. That is now becoming much more normalized. So and what I mean by that is, if you think back to how we've sort of traditionally had podcasts, the ads are often host read, and they often have offer codes, because offer codes means that I can track whether my ad on your podcast worked, because I typed in the right coupon code to get a bit of money off as a listener, but also I've told the company that I've come via your podcast. If you look to the sort of more wider forms of advertising, the sort of more brand-led advertising, rather than have a host tell you about how wonderful the new Ford whatever SUV is, Ford would just make an ad, and they've for years made radio ads like that. And it's more a question of those sort of branded, that kind of branded advertising, but using the abilities to at least dynamically serve that ad, so that so the old format would often be what you call baked in, which means that you add the ads at the time you make the podcast, and to change them is a bit of a faff because someone's got to re-edit the audio file. Dynamically served means that it's done on the fly, and if I'm listening to a very old episode of a program, I'm still hearing relevant ads today if I downloaded it today. And not only that, I'm in London, but someone else in New York hears an American ad, and so on and so forth, and you hear that. The technology is there, and it's a much bigger part of the mix now, and you definitely see that shift over. That's not to say there isn't enormous value in host read, but actually even dynamically serving host read is now a thing. And in the future, I can imagine a kind of AI kind of ability to almost have a voice do that without actually the host having to do 15 different versions of a live read to reach different audiences.
And I'd like to just jump in and say kind of well done, actually, to all of the podcast hosting services out there, because that dynamic insertion has become really quite straightforward for everyone. It's not something that you need to have a big operation to deal with. You just kind of record your audio, decide where you want it, slot it in. So as an independent podcaster, maybe you find the same thing on your cycling show. I love that feature. It's great.
Yeah, no, it's super easy. I mean, it's just at the time. I mean, not only that, you've just got to make sure that you build the breaks into your show, and away it goes. Maybe just agree with your podcast host if there's particular genres of ads that you prefer not to be advertising in it. I mean, but that's a separate discussion.
So, the technology has evolved. What about the listenership in terms of, clearly it's changed in terms of how many people are listening, but what about the demographic view? You said earlier that some ethnic demographics are particularly well served by podcasts. And you also mentioned that, broadly speaking, the male-female audience is on a par. I think it's possible, depending which genre and where you're looking, it's skewing one way or another. But how have those things changed, do you think, in the last, 5 years?
I think what you're finding is it's probably just spreading outwards. So you've got people who have been listening to podcasts for many years. They perfectly understand what a podcast is, even though their cohort now is in one of the older age demographics. The percentage of 65 pluses who listen to podcasts is just going to grow, because every time someone hits their 65th birthday and they already listen to podcasts, they're just sort of seeding that. And, young people, podcast is a thing. So you're just broadening it out. The real reason for that is who's making podcasts and who they're targeting as audiences. if there wasn't a podcast that was available or was of interest to you, why would you do it? It's become much more normalized. Pretty much every big reality show on television now has a sister podcast, and a lot of those are aimed at quite young groups. And so, that's a good funnel into it. We've had a lot of celebrities come into podcasts, not always successfully, but undoubtedly those kind of things. It's like, if I like that person, they're doing a podcast and I've not found out about podcasts previously, that's a route in. And, like many kinds of media, once I find that podcast and maybe I find some other ones I'm interested in. So all of those things have become, kind of normalized.
Adam, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and it's brilliant actually to get that sort of picture and survey of what's happening in the UK podcast scene. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this edition of the Content Mavericks Club. Many, many thanks to my guest, Adam Bowie, for sharing his insights into UK podcast listening. You'll find links to Adam's blog in the description if you want to see his analysis firsthand. I really recommend you go and check it out. There's lots to dig into there. And thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, please leave us a 5-star review. It really does help us reach more listeners. And if you'd like to learn more about other guests and future plans for the show, head over to contentmavericks.club. Thanks again for your company. Join us again next time for the Content Mavericks Club. Bye for now.